Let us be precise about what just happened. The President of the United States stood before an audience and delivered a speech that contained claims of such monumental consequence that they deserved hours of careful, scrutinizing analysis. Instead, they were delivered in the same rambling, digressive, self-congratulatory style that has become so familiar that people have stopped hearing how genuinely alarming the substance actually is. And that is exactly the problem. When a man who mispronounces the name of a military commander he personally ordered killed, who loses his grammatical thread mid-sentence, who cannot complete a coherent paragraph without circling back to remind you how great he is, when that man is also the person making life and death decisions. For the most powerful military in human history, the style is not separate from the substance. The style is evidence about the substance, and what it tells you should concern every serious person paying attention. Start with Ukraine. Trump said 25,000 soldiers are dying every single month in the war between Russia and Ukraine. If that number is accurate, it is a catastrophe of almost incomprehensible scale. 300,000 soldiers killed per year. That would make this conflict one of the bloodiest in modern history. But notice what Trump does with that number. He does not dwell on the human tragedy of it. He does not express grief or outrage on behalf of the dead. He uses it immediately in the very next breath as evidence of his own indispensability. A war which would have never happened if I were president. That is his response to 25,000 deaths per month. Not a policy framework. Not a detailed diplomatic strategy, not an acknowledgement of the geopolitical complexities that allowed this war to begin and continue, just the assertion that his personal presence would have been sufficient to prevent it. This is a man who genuinely believes that global history pivots on whether or not he specifically is sitting in a particular office. That level of self-regard, presented as foreign policy analysis, should give every thinking person pause, and the claim itself does not hold up to scrutiny. Putin's ambitions toward Ukraine did not materialize overnight. They were visible, documented, and repeatedly warned about by intelligence agencies across multiple administrations. The annexation of Crimea happened in 2014 during Trump's pre-presidential years. The buildup of Russian forces along the Ukrainian border was happening in the final months of Trump's first term. The idea that a phone call from Trump or Trump's mere presence in the White House would have caused Vladimir Putin, a man who has spent decades methodically rebuilding Russian imperial influence and who operates on a strategic timescale that has nothing to do with American election cycles, to abandon his most significant geopolitical objective is not a serious foreign policy argument. It is a boast. And boasts are not strategies. Boasts do not stop wars. Boasts do not bring back the 25,000 people Trump himself says are dying every month. Then he moved to Iran. And this is where the speech stops being merely frustrating and starts being genuinely frightening. Trump claimed that in June, the United States military conducted an operation called Operation Midnight Hammer, a direct strike on Iranian soil, and obliterated Iran's nuclear weapons program. Let the full weight of that sink in. He is saying American forces attacked a sovereign nation on its own territory. He is saying this happened. He is presenting it as a triumph, a breakthrough, something to be proud of. And he delivered this claim in the middle of a rambling speech without the kind of careful, measured, legally and diplomatically precise language that an act of war against a sovereign nation, because that is what a military strike on Iranian soil is, absolutely demands. The international laws governing military strikes on sovereign nations are not ambiguous. The United Nations Charter is not ambiguous. The requirement for congressional authorization for acts of war under American law is not ambiguous. None of that appeared to be a consideration. Trump announced what amounts to an act of war in the same breath he used to call Iran the kings of the roadside bomb. There was no legal framework offered. There was no explanation of what congressional consultation occurred. There was no accounting for how America's allies were informed or consulted. There was just the announcement delivered like a trophy. And then, and this is the part that reveals how catastrophically this approach to foreign policy can unravel, he admitted it did not work. He said Iran is rebuilding. He said they wiped it out and Iran wants to start all over again. He said they are at this moment again pursuing their sinister ambitions. So the military strike that he presented as a triumphant breakthrough, the operation he named and celebrated, the attack on a sovereign nation that presumably cost enormous resources and carried enormous risks, it did not achieve its stated objective. Iran is rebuilding its nuclear program. The obliteration was not an obliteration. It was a setback. And now Trump is standing before an audience telling them Iran is reconstituting what was destroyed while simultaneously being in negotiations with Iran, while simultaneously threatening further military action, while simultaneously saying his preference is diplomacy. These positions do not cohere. They are not a strategy. They are a collection of impulses presented as policy. Consider what it means that Iran is apparently rebuilding after being struck. Either the strike was less comprehensive than Trump claimed, which raises questions about the accuracy of his characterization of it as obliterating the program, or the strike was comprehensive and Iran has the technical capacity and the political will to rebuild from scratch, which raises the question of what the strike actually accomplished beyond temporarily setting back a program that Iran is clearly determined to complete regardless of the military costs. Neither of those possibilities supports the triumphant framing Trump applied to Operation Midnight Hammer. Both of them suggest that military force alone is not going to resolve the Iranian nuclear question, which is exactly what decades of strategic analysis by people far more qualified than Trump have consistently concluded. The numbers Trump threw out about Iranian repression of its own people are also worth examining. He claimed Iran killed approximately 32,000 of its own protesters in just the last couple of months. 32,000 people shot and hanged by their own government in weeks. That would be one of the largest mass killings of civilians by a government in recent history. It would be an event of such magnitude that it would be impossible to conceal from the international community, impossible for human rights organizations to miss, impossible for journalists across the world not to document extensively. Trump delivered this figure with characteristic imprecision. It looks like 32,000 protests, he said, accidentally calling the victims protests rather than protesters, suggesting he was not entirely sure of the number he was citing or what it referred to. When a president is making claims of this gravity with that level of imprecision, the credibility of the entire account becomes a legitimate question. He also claimed that American threats of serious violence stopped Iran from hanging even more people. Think about what that claim means. He is saying the United States government threatened a sovereign nation with violence to influence its internal treatment of its own citizens. That may or may not be true. It may or may not be justifiable depending on your framework for humanitarian intervention. But it was stated as a casual aside, with no explanation of how that threat was communicated, through what channels, with what legal authority, and with what plan if Iran had called the bluff. This is how Trump discusses decisions that involve the potential use of American military force against another country. As an aside. As a boast, as a passing detail in a speech primarily designed to make him look strong and decisive. The reference to Soleimani, whom Trump called Soleimania, mangling the name of a man he ordered killed, a man whose death nearly triggered open war between the United States and Iran, a man whose killing was one of the most consequential American military decisions of the 21st century, is not a small thing. It is not a forgivable verbal slip. If you order the killing of one of the most powerful military figures in the Middle East, if you make a decision that brings two countries to the brink of war, if you take an action that your own administration spent weeks managing the fallout from, the absolute minimum standard of seriousness. That the gravity of that decision demands is that you remember the person's name correctly. Trump called him the father of the roadside, leaving the sentence unfinished as though the details were beneath the effort of completion. This is not the behavior of a man who is carrying the weight of these decisions. This is the behavior of a man who is collecting them as trophies without fully reckoning with what they cost. And at the center of all of it is the fundamental contradiction that defines Trump's entire approach to foreign policy. He says he prefers diplomacy. He says Iran wants to make a deal. He says negotiations are ongoing. And then he says he will never allow Iran to obtain a nuclear weapon, stated as an absolute with no conditions and no exceptions. But Iran is rebuilding. The strike did not end the program. Diplomacy has not yet produced the words Trump is waiting to hear. So what comes next? If diplomacy fails, and the track record of this administration's diplomacy with Iran does not inspire overwhelming confidence, and Iran continues rebuilding, which Trump himself says they are doing, then the logic of his own absolute statement leads directly to another military strike, a bigger one. Against a country that has already demonstrated it will absorb a strike and continue anyway. Against a country with the missile capability to threaten American bases across the region. Against a country whose proxies are embedded across the Middle East and whose retaliation options are numerous and potentially catastrophic. Trump does not appear to have grappled with any of this in any serious public way. He has not explained the strategic endgame. He has not described what a successful diplomatic resolution looks like in detail. He has not accounted for the possibility that Iran's determination to develop nuclear capability is not something that can be permanently resolved through either strikes or negotiations conducted the way this administration conducts them. He has simply declared that it will not happen, as though the force of his declaration is itself a strategy. It is not. Declarations are not strategies. Obliterations that do not obliterate are not victories. Wars that kill 25,000 soldiers a month are not prevented by the personal magnetism of any single president. And the world's most dangerous regional nuclear question is not resolved by a speech in which the speaker cannot complete his sentences, cannot remember the names of the people he has ordered killed, and cannot reconcile the contradictions between the positions he is simultaneously holding. The most powerful military in human history is being directed by a man who announced an act of war as a boast, admitted it failed as an aside, and presented his preferred solution as waiting to hear secret words from the country he just bombed. That is not strength. That is not strategy. That is not the kind of leadership that the complexity and the danger of this moment in history demands. And the fact that we have become so accustomed to it that we process it and move on, that normalization, that exhausted acceptance of the extraordinary as ordinary may turn out to be the most dangerous thing of all.